We're working through an exciting event, and we're working through very informative and engaging plenary sessions. We have, as Peter set out yesterday, a map of things we want to address. We want to address different aspects of the evidence cycle. We want to address user engagement, question formulation, the methods to be used in generating evidence, and then knowledge translation. So among these different areas, we have had speakers addressing different parts of them. We'll have more tomorrow. Tomorrow the focus shifts to a specific task, which is combating poverty, addressed by colleagues working with the Roundtree Foundation. And we have the use of science to improve policing, addressed by Peter Nerud. So they are tomorrow's plenary sessions. Today we can welcome Amanda Edwards. There's a slight change to the printed programme. We have Amanda Edwards and not Tony Hunter speaking on behalf of SCIE. Amanda is the Deputy Director General, and she began her career, I believe, as a social worker. She's worked with SCIE for 11 years. She is in an excellent position to share a wealth of experience in order to address today's topic, which is the prospects for evidence-based approaches to social care. I think SCIE is not a television channel, just for clarity. The Social Care Institute for Excellence is the title, and I think the word excellence is worth chewing on a little bit, because a lot of us and a lot of the challenges facing the different areas of activity around evidence are about getting towards excellence or moving towards excellence, improving the system and improving the rigor around our approaches to these key questions, which can help us secure better futures for individuals and for communities. Excellence. Very nice to introduce a speaker whose mission is excellence. Amanda Edwards.
Great, thank you very much, Eamon, for that really nice introduction. I've obviously got a lot to live up to with a mission towards excellence. So within my talk, I will do my best to do that. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I was looking with Eamon at the kind of list of people attending, and it's extremely impressive, just the breadth of countries from around the world that are represented here. I think is a real opportunity for exchange of ideas, and I hope that kind of my talk will be a sort of small part and contributing to that exchange. The title of my talk is Purpose and Practicality, Co-Producing Social Care Evidence. In thinking about this session, we chose that deliberately because of the link that we think is there between being purposeful and being practical and the prospects for evidence-based approaches in social care. And what I'm going to do in my talk is sort of explain to you what we've been doing at SCIE over the last 11 years, often with other partners in England and other parts of the UK, to kind of develop that approach. So hopefully this will click me on. No, it doesn't, never mind. Yeah. So here's a summary. So I'm going to say a bit about SCIE because we're part of that story. As I said, I'm going to talk about purpose and practicality because of its importance. Then talk through a few examples of work we've either currently engaged in or have done, and then leave you really with a few reflections, I think, on the prospects as in my title. So, just to start with SCIE, right from the beginning, SCIE's mission really has been about how you use evidence to improve practice. And that sits at the heart of what we do. We do a lot of work to identify, share, and promote the use of evidence in practice. And that, again, has been a very significant part. So we've worked very much not only on how you develop the evidence, but also on the methods we need to use to encourage people to use it and make it real for them in their daily practice. We've also recently been thinking quite a bit about the whole aspects of our role. So as I've said, there's a focus on practice. There's also a focus on how we inform policy development, and particularly at the moment, because of the number of changes in policy and in legislation in the UK, on how we support policy implementation. And the approach that we've been taking is very much one of collaboration with partners, with the sector, so with practitioners, with managers from within social care, and also with people who use services, their families and their carers. We've developed over those years, although, as I'll say again at the end of my talk, there's never any room for complacency, but we have developed a reasonable reputation and quite a good reach into social care, although you can always reach much, much further. And to do that, we've developed a really diverse range of products. So we have summaries of the work that we've done. We develop materials for learning, particularly e-learning materials. We have, and again, going back to the fact we're not a TV channel, we do actually have a service called Social Care TV, not SCIE TV, but Social Care TV. That we found very useful as a way of promoting evidence, and we've done a lot of work about how we produce really helpful web-enabled guides and other products. Going back to Eamon's comment about SCIE, I was once going to a briefing session, I think it was about a bit of government legislation, and I was asked at the door who I was from, and I said, oh, hello, I'm Amanda Edwards and I'm from SCIE, thinking they'd know, and I was immediately sent with a look of anxiety towards the press desk, obviously to be chaperoned and looked after, at which point I realised I'd better correct what had gone on. So, that's us. A little bit more about the kind of ideas around purpose and practicality. It's, I think, one of the things that's really important about social care these days, and of course this is something that's changed over time, and probably even changed and developed during the time that SCIE's been working, is the expectation that the voice of people who use services and their families, young people as well, is an essential part of what constitutes and contributes to good quality social care practice. So that, I think, has meant that right from the beginning, we've thought very hard about how we ensure that that voice and perspective is represented within our works. So that's very much key to the task and the purpose of making things better for people, because that's essentially what all this is about. I think also we've recognised, and this relates to the second bit of the slide, that actually to do this, we are working with and through the people who provide services, because it's they who have the day-to-day contact with people who use services. So they are our key audience. And a lot of the time, what they're doing is making really, really difficult decisions for people, with people, about situations. And so a lot of what we're doing is producing work that's going to help inform the judgments that they make. And many years ago, I came across what I thought was a really helpful definition of judgment in this context, which was that it's the decisions that do not make themselves. So what we're about is helping people, be they people who use services, social workers, other frontline staff, managers, designing and planning, to make the decisions that do not make themselves. And finally, our social care sector is a very practical one. It's also a very busy one, quite a stressed one, and what people are interested in is how will this evidence, how will this guide you've produced, how will, this summary you're giving me, how will this help me do what I have to do? It may change the way I do it, it may change what I plan, but how's it actually going to help me? And those are some of the things that we've thought it's always very, very important to keep in mind. And I think also what I've become aware of is that really throughout it's necessary that infuses what you do, and it affects really the methods you take, the way we do our work to develop guides, guidance and other products, and then also the way we promote, disseminate, so essentially the kind of knowledge translation task. So all of those things, we need to hold these things in mind. And I think if we're honest, we all know that sometimes when we're really, really busy doing, some of those things about purpose and practicality get a bit lost. So we need to have structures in place really that keep reminding us of them. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how we work to develop evidence that does improve outcomes. I'm not going to talk all the way through this slide, but kind of pick up some of the key points about that approach. The first is the one about co-production and how really important it is to identify the improvements that users want to see, and to really focus very, very hard on that, and make sure that the research, the reviews we're doing are addressing what I've put the right questions. They do need to be focused. They do need to work as a research question, and they need to be about things that matter. Because if they're not about things that matter, even if it's kind of a really, really good piece of work, people aren't going to pay a lot of attention to it. So that's really, really important. And I think what we've found is that working with the sector, with people who use services, helps us to do that, and then also helps us at the end of the process to ensure that the products are really accessible to them. And we need to be pragmatic, and we need to use methods that are fit for purpose. And what SCIE does, as I'll explain a bit later, is draw on different types of knowledge. And we need then to complement that research evidence with expert opinion. And again, I'll go on to talk about that. And finally, and really, really importantly, we need to reflect the wider context. One of the questions we're always being asked by our social care sector is how does this fit? You know, I've got regulations, I've got inspectors, I've got policy guidance, I've got legislation, I've got what the commissioners want. How does this fit with all of that? And I think that kind of awareness of the wider context is really, really important. And I think that contrasts quite a bit with the clinical world, where actually, certainly in certain aspects of medicine and health, that wider context is actually less important. But I think, again, what we've found is we have to keep that in mind, because otherwise what we're doing isn't going to make sense to people and isn't going to be helpful. So I'm sure most people here are very, very familiar indeed with the term evidence-based practice or evidence-informed practice. And within our social care sector, that is something that people recognise as being important. But what's as important is practice-informed evidence, the two pieces of the jigsaw, if you like. And what I want to talk briefly about is how we recognise this mutually reinforcing relationship in our work at SCIE, and also in the work that we do for NICE to develop guidance. And there is indeed a session, this is a plug for a session tomorrow after you all have been at the gala dinner, and probably the sun will still be shining, but there is a session tomorrow at which colleagues of mine are going to be talking in a lot more detail about how we do the systematic reviews for our guidance development. As I've said, SCIE tends to think about knowledge in terms of data from 5 types: research, organisational evidence, frontline practitioner experience, and the views and experiences of people who use services and their carers. And we think, and the way we've designed some of our processes, is to make the most of that kind of mutually reinforcing relationship. The other thing that's kind of related to that, and related, I think, to the use of evidence in social care, is that there can sometimes be a sense that there is an answer out there, that you've just got to do the research, produce the evidence, and the answer will magically appear. Now, of course, we know that that's not right, and not the case. And that, as I've said before, you know, it's the decision-making, those judgments, that there are the bridge between what you know and what you actually do, and what the data tells you. And that's actually why it's so important that the evidence is interrogated by people with that kind of practice and service delivery expertise, so that we see how it works in the context of frontline practice, and indeed in the wider national and local environment. So, my first case study is going to be about the work that we do under contract to NICE to develop their guidance for the social care sector. SCIE leads a collaboration, the partner with a number of partners from the UK, including the Epicentre, our personal social services research unit to provide the economics input, and also Research in Practice, who are an organisation who've been working in the UK for quite a long time to really help the use of research evidence within social care in both adults and children's services. And we provide a programme commissioned by NICE to develop their social care guidance. One of the things that's very important about our collaboration is that we are rooted in social care, and that we collectively, as a partnership, have a reputation for working with service users, because that has always been recognised as being a really, really important component. The other thing that was new and different, NICE commission within the UK a number of collaborating centres to develop their guidelines. Ours was the first to have the task of dissemination and adoption actually included within our remit. And that's had quite an important effect on how we've been developing our work. So, guideline development groups, they underpin the way in which guidelines are developed. And I think for our sector, social care, a guideline development group was quite a new thing, because what they do is, we're very used to advisory groups where people come along and provide advice and someone goes away and takes that advice or doesn't take that advice. Guideline development groups are actually given the task of developing the guideline. So they're absolutely integral. And it's a really good example of co-production, because what you get is a real mix. So we have practitioners, we have service users, we have managers, we have people from our voluntary sector, a real mix of people. We have researchers who come together and, if you like, work with the evidence to develop the recommendations. So that what you get at the end is something that has had, the rigour of the evidence assessment combined with that interrogation that I talked about earlier from people who are working in the social care sector to come up with the recommendations themselves. And my view is it's a very powerful part of the NICE process. And what we do at the beginning is do quite a lot of work, going back to what I was saying about the importance of context, just trying to contextualise the evidence. So we use that first stage, the scope, to kind of really outline the practice, policy and legislation environment, as well as be very clear about what the guideline is actually going to cover. We then do what's called a baseline service assessment. And what that aims to do is map the landscape and really assess those areas where practice is working well and where practitioners and service users identify areas for improvement. And that then helps to inform the questions and evidence for the systematic review. So again, keeping that eye on the context. And then obviously we come back to the guideline development groups with the evidence from the reviews. And one of their tasks really is to be working with and synthesizing from all this, all the range of data that they have. So that's one of the ways in which we try to set the evidence in context and keep that context in mind throughout the process. And this, I think, gives an idea of the process itself, of the whole process itself, really. And there'd just be a couple of points I'd make there, again, to kind of emphasize the thinking about audience, thinking about dissemination, starts right at the beginning. And also just a little bit about the task of developing the recommendations. It's a relatively new programme. We're only sort of just into our second year. So we're just beginning to work with our first guideline development groups to do this. One of the things that I've always thought is so interesting about this process is the way in which you do get that dynamic between the practitioner and the evidence. A while ago, kind of got two examples of this from some very early work that SCIE did about foster care, and in particular looking at what we knew about the outcomes for children of contact with parents. And the evidence was very equivocal at the time. And the researchers were a bit kind of worried about this because there wasn't anything definite they were going to be able to give to the practitioner group. And two things happened. One was the practitioners actually said, gosh, that's a relief. You know, we sort of know that we don't really know, and we know it was in fact quite reassuring for them that there wasn't a clear answer, because that was their kind of daily experience. So they weren't upset by it. It kind of helped them a bit. And the second thing was that there were things, that one of the things that was contained within the evidence was quite a lot about ways in which contact could be well and less well managed. And the practitioners looked at it and said, gosh, that's really, really useful. That's what needs to be in our recommendation, because that will help us. And it's that kind of, I think, iterative process that really helps to develop the recommendations. And I think really helps to get the kind of specificity that helps people in practice. So my second case study is going to be about some work that SCIE did over a period of years and some years ago on parental mental health and child welfare. This was some work that we called Think Parent, Think Child, Think Family. And it was sponsored by the Department of Health. And we started off with the intention of finding out what do we know about interventions and support that can improve the outcomes and life chances of families affected by parental mental ill health. What do practitioners need to do differently? What needs to be in place to support them in changing their practice? And we took a whole family model to this work rather than focus solely on evaluating interventions, because we were keenly aware, and actually it was very much part of the policy context and drive at the time, that we wanted to think about what practitioners do in context, and the context for their work at the time was the family. And we were also very much aware of the effects of strategy, service design, and procedures, as shown on the slide, on what practitioners do. We did a number of things. We did a systematic review, and we also complemented that with case studies in a number of, in fact, in 10 sites in England and here in Northern Ireland, which sought information on all of these aspects. We then produced a guide, and then after that, we did a programme of work going back to those sites on implementation. And that involved working with the sites to understand actually what it meant to put guides into practice. And from that, we produced a whole range of resources that came out of that. Posters for schools, joint working protocols and frameworks, briefing notes, all sorts of things. And that was all aimed at making the research real. And what I'm going to show you here is the e-learning module, or the kind of resource that we developed from this, because what it does is really bring it together very well. What you see on the slide is the landing page, and what people can then do is work through the information in the guide. What we were trying to do here is recognise that not everyone will actually have the time or indeed want to read a written report or a written guide. So what we've done is kind of organise this in what you might call bite-sized content. And we've tried to design the resource so that it's very, very easy for people to navigate to and find what they feel is most relevant to them at that particular point in time. And we've done some things to make sure it's accessible. The bottom left is a facility to listen to the text. And the other thing you can do at the bottom left is also click to access the learning aims, because that helps you work out what is going to help meet your needs. We've done some work with some of our kind of sister organisations in the UK, particularly Skills for Care, whose priority is workforce development, so that actually what's in this is mapped onto our national qualifications and credit framework within the UK. So that helps people with their continuing professional development, and it builds transferable credits that demonstrate their learning, and again, things that are informed by the evidence. And it helps to demonstrate how this is relevant to their work. So that's kind of one example of the sorts of things that we do to really kind of help people in our sector make use of evidence to inform the work that they're doing on a daily basis. So, what are the prospects? I've always quite liked, I've used this slide quite a lot about surfers catching the wave, because I often think prospects, particularly in environments that are, very much influenced by policy change, it is a bit like catching the wave. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, and then you have to wait for the next one to come along. But of course, when you're thinking about prospects, and if you think about that surfer, it's not pure luck that he's caught that wave. Actually, what he or she's been doing is watching, and they're ready. And that I always think has quite a lesson for us in this kind of evidence-based approaches activity. You really need to keep an eye on what's going on, and you need to try and make sure you're ready. The other thing that we can do that I don't think he can do much with the SCIE is influence. So you need to think about how you're influencing what's happening in order to improve your prospects. As I said, real good eye on the environment. And then you need to think about your own skills, the kind of capacities you've got, and reflect on your experience. So let's start with the environment and the kind of context. And I'm only talking about the context, obviously, in the UK at the moment. Huge pressures of time and money. Resources shrinking, great anxiety about that, and people who are very short of both. And I just think we should never, ever underestimate that. We have a very diverse workforce. The estimates of the numbers go up and down a bit, but 1.4 million will do for now. 40,000 providers working in adult social care, probably about another 15 to 20 working in children's social care. And our audience, because of some of the changes over the last 10 years, includes people who manage, fund and arrange their own services. So hugely diverse. And that in itself is, of course, a massive challenge. Number of, if you like, current policy themes about personalisation, really trying to fit services to people, take account of their needs, aspirations. At the same time, focus on protection, quite a bit in our new care bill about how you protect vulnerable adults, and that is a continuing, relentless focus within our children's social care services, and a lot about integration at the moment, particularly on the adult side, with, I think, probably a lot of different kind of definitions and agendas around what integration means, what it means for people, and what you have to do. And I think also it's a sector in which evidence and practice is contested, and in which we have to recognise that there are lots and lots of other things that influence and drive what people do. So it's one of the things, but there are lots of others. There are lots of areas in which the evidence is contested. But we do have some experience, and this really reflects a bit on the experience that we've had in social care. One of the things that we've learnt is that you need to focus on the levels of the system and on the level of practice. So it's no good just looking at individual practice. You really need to look at the management and support arrangements around that and how the system works. As I've said, you need to demonstrate coherence with other things, and you need to be able to show the benefits as well. And we've actually done quite a lot of work just, getting stories from people about how, using evidence helped them, what they've done, because people need to understand the benefits to answer the sort of, well, why should I? It's a collaborative endeavour. We need to be very wary of, appearing to issue wise words from on high. We really need to work very hard at saying, this has come from you, we've worked together on this. The importance of social influence, word of mouth, is incredibly important in terms of changing what people do. And actually that's one of the reasons why we started off the social care TV service, and often the videos are very much from the perspective and use the voices and stories either of people who use services or of frontline care staff, because that reaches out and speaks to people. And it's all related then back to the kind of evidence resource. What you produce has to be easy to use and easy to find. And actually, I think the web's made that more difficult because people are very, very impatient web users. If you can't get what you want, you go away. And we all do that, and the people who come to our sites are no different. So you really need to make sure that when people land in the middle of something, they can find their way to what they want really, really easily. And I've put less is more. One of the sort of early feedbacks I got was, this is great rigorous stuff, but it's all far too long. And you have to, and someone once said to me, short is never short enough. So we then produced things we thought were shorter, and they still weren't short enough. So you somehow have to get into the mindset of less is more. Somehow, how do we convey these messages in a way that's really, that contains their meaning and nonetheless is succinct. So, in conclusion, in terms of the kind of, just to conclude with sort of a couple of personal reflections, having been involved in this for about the last 10 or 11 years. The first is a point just simply about persistence. You just have to keep at it. This is, so that's important. The second is there is no room to be complacent. You're only ever as good as your last product, so no room for complacency, either about how we've done or indeed about the prospects. And I think it's also, I don't know if this is true of other sectors or other places, or whether it's a very English thing, but it is true that people can be both welcoming of an idea and deeply sceptical at the same time. So it's worth keeping that in mind. So, the prospects. We have had some investment in evidence. The kind of work that NICE does is, I think, an indication of some additional investment. We've, over the last 5 years, had a new School for Social Care Research, and we do have the What Works centres, which are very much about what works in social policy areas. So there is some investment. So that's always good for prospects. We can learn from our history and experience, from SCIEs, from organisations like EPI, like Research in Practice, like Making Research Count. You know, we've got some history. We need to use that learning. It is a very difficult context, and we need to remember that. There are aspects of that context that arguably make evidence even more important, because some of the decisions people are making are even more difficult and more critical. We need to hold on to the importance of co-production, because I think, as I've said, that's one of the things that makes the work purposeful and practical, and that's not the only thing, but may well help to improve prospects. And you always need to keep your audience in mind, because that will help as well. And the final thing I would say was, it's not original to me, this at all, but many years ago, I was listening to someone talk about implementation and what was the test. You know, how did you know? He came up with something that I've always found quite helpful, which is, you know you have succeeded when someone tells you it was their own idea. So, any questions? And thank you very much. Stay here.
Yeah, we have about a quarter of an hour for questions and comments, so we'll just leave you to it. Thank you very much again for a fine presentation.
That's okay, that's fine.
Thank you. This is a very interesting presentation. This is Hans Bos from the American Institutes for Research in Washington. I'm very interested in the standard setting groups, the guideline setting groups.
Yeah.
And we actually have tried some of that work domestically in the US. We call it co-interpretation. And one of the challenges that we find is that you can put people in a room together from all these different stakeholder groups, but that it still ends up being driven by certain people in the room. And I'm curious if you can say a little bit more about sort of the social dynamics of that, and I think actually somebody should study that at some point and see how to make these things work truly inclusively, even, you know, if physically people are in the same room. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I think you're absolutely right that the dynamics are very interesting, and I agree with you that, I mean, given that some organisations, particularly NICE, have been using this method for quite a long time, it would be very interesting to study it. Having said that, I guess, and we've drawn a fair bit on NICE's experience here, is that kind of, and also our experience is only of 1 year, so I'll be talking from that, and maybe a bit from kind of when I've been and observed other guideline development groups. And I'm sure you'll have found this too. The role of the chair is absolutely critical, and I think we do an open recruitment for chairs, and I've been involved in the interviewing, and and my observation so far is that, you know, the more experienced and skilled chair you can get, the easier it will be to kind of help manage the group. And that in terms of the chairs, we've had a couple because I think this actually really does matter in relation to your question about people taking over and particular groups driving it. Because in a sense, it's the chair's job to make sure that doesn't happen. And that one or two of our chairs have been extraordinarily successful in the kind of lightest, pleasantest possible way, utterly establishing their authority. And that's pretty hard to judge at interview, basically, but it really, really makes a difference. The other thing we have is we always have someone else in the group working with the chair to facilitate. So it's either myself or, my two senior colleagues, Beth Anderson and Carolyn Den, who are there with the chair in every meeting to kind of work with the chair to facilitate. So you've actually got two people at least keeping an eye on the dynamic, and probably a few more because there's quite a few people from the team there. There's something about at the beginning setting out some very, very clear ground rules. The other thing we've done is we have a sort of 2-day induction session, and after that, a member of our staff has phoned each member, Guideline Development Group member, to kind of talk to them about their experience, find out if they've got any training needs. And actually that can highlight those sorts of concerns. I think the other thing we've also are doing is kind of thinking about, we've got a group coming up. I haven't done this yet, so don't know how it'll work, but we're going to do more work in small groups. And we now know the groups well enough, so we can do a bit of social engineering. We can, put people together which we think will work. So I think the other thing, and I think this is the thing that, me or my colleagues working with these guideline development groups have to do, is also you have to bring people back to the evidence, and that can help in terms of reducing that kind of the dominant group effect, because actually what we have to produce at the end has to relate back to the evidence we've considered and then the kind of interpretation that people have put on that in order to develop the recommendation. So there's also something about the process I think can help. But none of that takes away from some of that difficulty. I think that's it's a real challenge, and it's a challenge we've got in some of our groups at the moment, that and it's not always the people who you think it will be either. That's the other thing. So yeah. Oh, is that loud?
I'm just.
Do you want to show?
Thank you very much. Bearing in mind the audience and the international context in which we work, I wonder, could you comment on this, the relation of international sphere of activity and the national context? My feeling is that a lot of the evidence knowledge is not limited to national frontiers. A lot of the evidence comes from other places or from international contexts, and that gives a couple of challenges and possible gains. One of the challenges, how do we best summarize international evidence at the start of the phase and then begin to tease out what the implications or the relevance to the national context. And the other dimension is when in a national guidelines process we go through a process of vetting and assembling evidence, are there ways to share that with other national exercises which are really doing parallel processes? I think there must be room for a gain and for synergies in adding evidence at the international level and integrating it into national level. And this is actually part of what Campbell wants to encourage.
Okay. Yes, I mean, maybe just thinking about your kind of first question about how we're dealing with international evidence, and I guess we're being fairly, in many ways, quite pragmatic about it. And obviously, when we do our searches, we look pretty broadly. So we, don't look just for UK based. We look for international evidence. I think we are, of course, and it goes back to what I say about context. We are very aware of the different contexts in different countries, and therefore, needing to, if we're using evidence from outside our own context, to find ways of dealing with that. We've also, because we and I think also, to be honest and pragmatically, it slightly depends on how much evidence, how much good evidence is available, so how many systematic reviews are available, which are UK-based. Because if we've got a lot of them, then we won't necessarily go beyond unless there's really, really good reason to. And we've had some quite big debates with our guideline development groups about that. On the other hand, if we're in the reverse position, then we will. And what you're sort of saying is, well, how likely, it happened, I think, with our questions on views and experiences of people who use services in home care. And, essentially, we had a lot of that from the UK. And the question was, well, is it, we have a limited resource here. Are we actually going to find out anything different from going much more broadly? Other questions, of course, we might. So I think it goes back to my slide where I said some of this is about being fit for purpose, and for what we're doing, we just need to make sure what we're doing is fit for purpose. On your question about guidelines, of course, that's kind of really that's actually really interesting. I mean, all the work that NICE does, all the work that SCIE does is available. Anyone can come and use it, can come and access it. And so I think the question about is there more one could do about that is actually a very interesting one, and maybe thinking about, well, if you took a particular example of a guide, what, we've had these discussions sort of within the UK, actually, just thinking about, because we have a contract, part of our work is with Northern Ireland, and quite often what we're doing there is saying, okay, we've got the course guide product, we need to make sure that the kind of policy, legislative context is correctly reflected for other parts of the UK, because it's increasingly different now. And then we need to make sure that, if you like, what we're saying about implementation works, because the structures, the way in which services are organised, are different. But quite a lot of that core is, likely to be as relevant elsewhere. So there may be something about, thinking along those lines that might be helpful.